Welcome everyone. Sorry about the slight delay. Hopefully now all working. Let me just double check. My mic is on. All right. All right. So this is public finance, lecture 8. We're going to talk about public choice theory. This is where we are in the schedule of the semester. We're now at lecture 8, opening the second half, basically, or now already in the second half after last week. So I'll have the following 3 lectures. So we're going to talk about public choice theory today. Then we're going to move on to sort of the other side of the government, which is taxation. So how the government gets money. You know, we're talking about a lot of things, how the government spends money until now. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about how the government's organized and how we organize ourselves to form a government. And we're going to move on to the second part about taxation next week. So this corresponds to chapter 7 and 8 in the textbook. A little overview about the course requirement is we're roughly half of the thing of the course of the semester. So you have problem set 1, which was due on March 25th. Any questions about problem set 1? You've all received your grade, hopefully in the Teams app. You all seen that? Yeah. No questions? All right. Perfect. And then problem set 2 will be announced next week, and you'll again have a week to finish it. So until April the 22nd in the evening. Then 1 week after that is the deadline for the Wikipedia. Any questions about that? All good? The system should be set up and working. Yeah. Cool. All right. The exam dates are in the SIS as well, already scheduled, so you can sign up to all of those 4. Any questions about that? It works just as any other course in at Charles University, so you have 3 tries. So, you know, you're encouraged not to wait until September, because then you would lose the 2 chances. If you fail the first one, you wouldn't have any more chances to retake the exam. Any questions? All good? Perfect. Then let's get to it. So, we're going to talk about public choice theory. Now, I'm going to introduce the topic a little bit, and I'm going to structure it into 4 chapters. 1 is preference revelations, how do we reveal what people want. The second one is preference aggregations, how do we aggregate what people want. And then we're going to talk a little bit about voting patterns, about some of the trends in how people vote recently. And then we're going to have a little chapter on power exercise, because that's kind of a very important sort of side topic to public choice theory. Now, what I mean by public choice theory, here you see a title, political economy. That's because those 2 terms are interchangeable. So I say public choice theory, but somebody might call it political economy. Those are 2 terms that mean very much the same thing. What it is a positive analysis of government. Okay, why do governments do what they do? Okay, it's not what the government should do, as would be the normative type of analysis. This is a positive type of analysis. Okay, so why do they behave the way they do? Now, in analyzing it, we have to remember that government is just an abstract entity, right? It's a construct of our thought, right? Of our society. In reality, the government is composed of individual people, right? And that's going to be the core of this. And we're going to define something called government failure. So we've talked a lot about market failures, right? This is similar. Government failure, meaning that it doesn't work the way it should. The way we define it is the inability or unwillingness of the government to act primarily in the interest of its citizens. Okay, failing the citizens in the sense that it does not behave in the way that we would want it to. So these government failures, just as market failures, are very important. Okay, they can have very large, very significant adverse effects on the people that live under that government rule. So a very stark example of this is the Korean divide, okay, between North and South. So the 2 Koreas used to be 1 country, and then they split up into North Korea and South Korea and chose very different paths of government. Okay, South Korea, a liberal democracy with market principles, etc. North Korea, a dictatorship, very closed economy, trying to protect its own economy from the external forces. And you can see how they ended up, economically. So you can see that the South Korean model seems to be, over a long period of time, to be performing much better than the North Korean model. And this is a trend sort of all over the world, right? So it seems like the government failures that are observed in the world are largely associated with what we call exclusive institutions, as opposed to inclusive institutions, which have been shown as sort of a very important or the single most important factor for economic growth, for economic development. There's a great book by Darren Lachimov and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail. I highly recommend you read that. It's on this topic exactly that, inclusive institution. What that means is that the government tries to include people in the way that the economy is organized, rather than an exclusive institution, which would try to exclude people from the way the government is organized by being authoritative and being, not having a participatory democracy. A very important sort of the core of this question of political economy is the public versus private provision of goods and services. Okay, so if we want to provide goods and services, such as those that solve some market failures, or those that redistribute, or those that stabilize the economy, we have to decide whether the public sector will provide it or the private sector will provide it, right? So that's what you have been talking about since the beginning of this semester. And now, so if we do decide to do it publicly, and we've seen some cases where it's a really good idea, probably, or most likely it's a great idea to do it, to publicly provide these goods and services, then what challenges do we face, basically? So when we want to make decisions collectively, there's a very simple, sort of straightforward principle that we have sort of culturally inside of us, I think, which is direct democracy, right? So say there are 3 people trying to decide where to go to a pub, right, in the evening. So a very sort of straightforward principle is that you vote, right? You have pub A, pub B, and then if 2 people want to go to pub A and then 1 person wants to go to pub B, you go to pub A, right? You decide simple majority, sort of direct democracy. So with a small number of people that make the decision collectively, it's quite easy, right? You can decide using direct democracy. So that's not the problem. But if it's a large number of voters, say this group, we would all have to decide where to go to one club, right? To make the decision pub A, pub B. Then there are transaction costs to this. Now, what I mean by these transaction costs is that, for example, some of you might not know pub B, right? So for you to make an informed decision about whether to choose pub A or pub B, you would have to know both of them, right? So that's an example of a transaction cost. Now, we would all have to make an informed decision in the sense that you would have to, know what those pubs are, and then decide. We don't want to do that for issues such as, healthcare and infrastructure, etc. Those are very complex issues, so the transaction costs are very, very large. And so what we do is we choose representatives. Okay, so what we could do is to choose 3 of us among us to have, pay them to make that decision for us, right? So this is used virtually in all countries of the world, and for all types of issues that the government is making decisions about. Right, so we choose representatives from among us. We employ them, right, in the public sector. We pay them money to spend on our behalf the time, discussing priorities and researching the options and then making a decision. There's a very nice principle that I like to mention here by Anthony Downs from 1957. It's a very old sort of paper that argues that we have these political parties, right? It's one more sort of level of this decision making. So we might organize ourselves into political parties and then vote for the parties rather than the candidates, but the principle is the same. So the parties will formulate the policies in order to win elections and not the other way around, not win elections in order to formulate policies, right? So in a representative democracy, the way the bottom-up principle works is that, okay, maybe there is a pub C that some of you might like. And so what would happen is that one of them, that faction, that group of people would basically have their own representative to be, to represent them, right? It's not that 5 people randomly select themselves and then formulate their policies. It's the bottom-up approach that's really important there in the representative democracy system. All right, so let's talk about making collective decisions. And we're going to talk about those three problems: preference revelation, preference aggregation, and power exercise. Before we get to power exercise, we're going to talk a little bit about how people vote recently, because I think it's quite an interesting trend that we're seeing. All right. So problem one is how to reveal preferences. Okay? How do you get information from people such that you can make these decisions, about their preferences? So if you're deciding about a private good, say a phone or Apple, right, or a chair, right, the way that the preferences are revealed is that you buy the good, right? So you either buy it or not buy it. If you don't buy it, you obviously have not preferred that one option enough, right? Now, with a publicly provided good and representative democracy system, we don't have the price system, right, to make decisions. So we don't bid for, for the views to be expressed. What we do is we vote, right? We vote for candidate X. Now, it turns out it's really hard to extract people's preferences in elections, right? So there's a number of problems. So I'm going to list some of them. I'm going to describe them briefly, and then we're going to dive into one of them. Okay. So we're not going to have time to go sort of through all of the issues here. We just have one lecture on this. So there are courses actually, in some other programs where they're focused just on political economy and can be the whole semester to spend it on this. So what we're going to do instead is, because we have just one lecture, we're going to describe the issues a little bit and then dive into one of them in more detail. So one problem is there are many opinions. In a country of 10 million, like the Czech Republic, you might have 250 different opinions on things. But you only have a small number of candidates, right? Almost by design, the candidates there's a lower number of candidates than the people, right? And so what you might end up with is to vote for the lesser evil, right? Your exact view might not be exactly represented by that candidate, but we sort of have to live with that somehow. There's no good solution to this. You just vote for the lesser evil, right? You vote for the candidate that is closest to your views, right? We have to decide who will vote. So we have to impose age limits, for example. There's a past of voter discrimination. So there were marginalized groups that were not able to vote. By the way, the last European country that introduced the voting rights for women and when that was? I was surprised when I read it. Switzerland? No, but you're close. So it was Liechtenstein in 1984. I was quite surprised by it. Not so far from when I was born, and then women were not allowed to vote on the. So it's only in the 20th century that women were allowed to vote almost anywhere around the world, which is quite crazy for them to. It can also be based on race, based on religion, etc. That discrimination has happened in the past mainly, and it's not happening so much anymore, luckily. With the age limits, most countries impose at 18, the age of 18 that you can start voting. There are some countries that have it since 16, and there is opinions about this. For example, I had a student write a bachelor thesis, quite an interesting topic, and there are many interesting topics, by the way, in this lecture for bachelor theses. Is that what would happen? How would people vote? How would the elections turn out if we had a voting age of 15 rather than 18? The argument being, a 17-year-old is a much sort of more fitted person to decide about the future than an 89-year-old person who's, most likely about to die in the next few years, right? So we do allow people to vote, until they die, but we do not allow people who have their whole future ahead of them to vote. So I would say that, philosophically, there is an argument to lower the voting age below 18. And so we were exploring what would be the effects of that. And young people vote generally quite differently than older people. And so it could have significant consequences for the election results. There are information asymmetries that we have to deal with when we extract people's preferences. So this is kind of related to the issue that not everybody will do the research, right? So if you vote on an issue and you're not very well informed about it, then you cannot make a proper decision, right? So that thereby making it hard to extract people's preferences because it's just costly to get all that information. There are individual biases and shortcomings. Anyone heard of the scope neglect? know what that is? The famous experiment by Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, where what they did is they asked people how much money would you be willing to pay to clean up one lake from acid pollutants. And then they asked another group of people, how much would you be willing to pay to clean up all the lakes in the country from this acid rain pollution? And the responses were roughly the same. Okay, so people don't really realize very well the issue at hand when the scope is large. Okay, so when we talk about a lot of units, we're not very well able to scale our preferences about that. Yeah, so there's various concepts, of individual biases, and this is all covered sort of by behavioral economics, and this is a vibrant field. So I encourage you to read more about that. There's one important one, I think, term that you should know about is this continued valuation surveys, which is basically on this, what I just described, okay? That you ask people how much would they be willing to pay to do something. That's one of the ways to track people's preferences in a more nuanced way, in this regard. And the problem of influencing other voters, there's lobbying, there's interest groups that might try to influence how people vote. There can be advertisements, billboards before elections, etc., that might have, differential impacts on different groups. And so this is kind of an issue when you want to extract people's true preferences. There have been cases in the past in the Czech Republic and in many other countries as well, where, candidates or political parties were caught offering money or things like donuts to voters to vote for that one particular party. Of course, this is giving the money is obviously illegal. Giving them donuts is kind of borderline in gray area. You're not sure where that line stands. And then one of the things that I want to talk about a little bit more today is transaction costs, okay? Extracting people's preferences, mainly or specifically related to voter turnout, because I think it's quite an interesting topic. All right, any questions about any of these? All right, so let's talk a little bit about voter turnout. So this is a chart of the turnout in Czech elections, the main ones to the Chamber of Deputies, Poslanecká sněmovna. So this is starting in 1988, and 1990 was the first election after the fall of communism. You can see that, so this is just the total number of people, and this is how many people voted for each party, based on the colors mean parties. So this orange will be ČSSD, the Czech Social Democrats, and then the different colors, as you might guess, this is the Civic Democratic Party, etc. So here that was the Communist Party, so indicating that this wasn't necessarily a free election. So one of the things to note about voter turnout is it's close to 100%. That's because it was illegal not to vote. Okay, back then. So you had to actually pay a fine not to come to the election poll. And so voter turnout is close to 100%. Since 1990, we had it voluntary, so it's now not mandatory to go vote. Even though there are some countries that do it, that actually have a fine if you don't turn up at the elections. We don't do that, and we end up with something like 50-60% of eligible voters to come to the polls. Now, if that's good or bad, there are various opinions on this. There are even voices to suggest that we should do that in the Czech Republic as well, to have mandatory voting to increase sort of the participation in the democratic process. But so far, nothing like that has happened. The turnout is quite different when you look at sort of more inside the country. So this is an example of the Slovak elections to the Chamber of Deputies. So in 2020, this is a histogram by county. So basically what you see is that there are some counties, 5 counties in Slovakia that had a turnout between 51 and 55%, all the way up to a turnout between 75 and 79%. So it greatly varies across counties. There are some counties that only half of the people come to vote, and there are some that 3/4 of the voters come to the election. Now, what influences the decision whether to vote or not? It's a vibrant area of research. How many of you voted in the, say, in the last presidential election? Those of you check. Yeah. So why did you do it? What was your motivation? So just this is called the voting paradox. So the idea being that your individual vote is very, very, very unlikely to change anything. but you have some costs associated with going to the election ballot, right? So why did you do it? Right? So the voting paradox is even though the costs greatly outweigh the benefits, the perceived benefit of influencing, the election, that people still go vote, and 60% of them do. So quite a big percentage. So basically, what economics tells you is that the fact that people go vote actually means that they perceive the benefit as higher than the costs, right? That's why they decided to go vote. That's why you all decided to go vote. So it's not about how you make that decision. It's about what you reveal as a preference. And so what economics will tell you is that okay, so the benefits were larger than the costs, right? So the costs might be small. You just go to the election poll, you participate in the democratic process, not something that you hate necessarily. But the benefits are large, right? Because not that your vote would influence the election so much, but maybe you feel good, right, about participating in the democratic process. Maybe you want to tell your friends that you voted because you want to be part of the democracy. So the benefits are larger than the costs, and that's why people go vote. But there are cases when the costs are too large for the perceived benefit. So, for example, if the election poll is very far away, say, classic case that a lot of students are here in Prague, but they're registered as voters in their hometown, say in South Korea, right, which is very far away, and so going to vote is quite costly, right? So without having sort of long distance voting, by correspondence, then the cost can be quite large, and so many people decide not to vote because these costs will, offset the benefits. So there are two types of factors that will influence the decision to vote, and there's quite good literature on all of these. And it's as I said, quite a vibrant field of research. So one of them is individual level. So for example, there's a relationship between age and the probability that you go vote. So it's relatively small in the beginning, and then larger for people around 40 and 50 years of age, and then declining again. This is one pattern that we observe, that age has a sort of more complex relationship with voter turnout. This opportunity cost of people who have a higher hourly wage are less likely to go vote because it costs them some of those working hours to go vote, right? So there's some evidence of this. Social status of married people, for example, I remember this result, married people are more likely to go vote for various reasons of social status, and being part of some more like a family-based community is more, you're more likely to go vote after that. So these are just correlations, nothing to say about causation, but still interesting to see. Then there are some interesting studies on the external or aggregate level influencers of the decision to vote. For example, weather influence. When I read that study, I found it quite funny that when it rains, some people are less likely to go vote. So is there any?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, so are you saying that there's actually a correlation between that rich people vote less? Because all I've ever heard is the opposite.
Yeah, so there are various studies on different subsamples. So if you dive into those, there is a study on trying to explain these things with opportunity costs. So among the people who are sort of controlling for social status and area and age and everything, all of the other factors. So if you have two very similar people, but one is making twice as much money, then that person is less likely to go vote in that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just seems completely vague.
What would be your?
My impression would be that the people who are at the bottom of society who are marginalized would feel less likely, feel less inclined to vote because they would probably not feel as represented by votes.
No, but they're the people are exactly the same, but one is making twice the hourly wage.
But that's a big factor.
Yeah, exactly. What do you mean?
What I mean is that my point is that I would just expect, because marginalized people make is also a proxy for making less money, I would say, for example.
Yes, but you're controlling for this, right? So you're trying to find pairs of exactly the same people who differ only in the hourly wage. Otherwise, they are exactly the same, identical people, right?
Okay.
So that's what those studies are trying to get at. How these individual factors, controlling for all of the other factors, all of the observable characteristics. So, you would have the same ethnic group, same age, and education, everything the same, except for hourly wage. Then the hourly wage is actually associated with lower. There's a study of this, not by me, but so that the way they explain that effect is through the opportunity cost channel, right? So the opportunity cost channel, somebody who has a higher wage because they have to take time off work often to go vote, then that's what explains the difference. That's the idea. And but you're coming at it, in the correct fashion. So you're thinking about it, you need to try and separate the causation from correlation, right? So yes, a higher wage controlling for nothing else will mean higher voter turnout. But the higher wage is not the thing that is causing this. It's the underlying, things like age and education levels and social status, etc., that make both your wage higher and your probability to go vote higher, right? So that would be a correlation, but not causation, right? So what the studies are trying to get at is just causation, to isolate the effect of those differences, by controlling for all those other. Right, so for the external factors, so there are some interesting results there. So, when it rains, when it's bad weather, people are less likely to go vote. And actually, there were some studies in the US, showing that voters of specifically the Republican Party are less likely to be influenced by the weather. So if it rains, it's actually better for the Republicans. Okay, and there are some counties, because of the setup that they have in the US, where once you flip to 50.1%, the whole county goes red or blue. Then what that meant is actually there's quite a bit of a difference in the final result just because it rained, right? Which is not something probably that we would like to see in elections, that the weather would influence how we decide policies for the next 4 years. And so, those are issues that we have to deal with when designing an electoral system, right? There's some nice evidence of campaign spending. So apparently more campaign spending generally is good for the party, for the turnout. Unless it's too much campaign spending, it's at the very end, people perceive like it's everywhere, and they should get disgusted by the elections basically. And so if, for example, so they also split up between positive and negative campaigns. So if the campaigns are largely negative, then people are sort of just tired of it and don't go for it rather than do, even if the spending is higher, right? Close polls are interesting. So if the election polls, the predictions of how the election will go is close. So if your candidate is just about, the same result as the other guy, then you're more likely to go vote, which makes sense, but, also not something probably that you want to have, a large influence of in your elections. All right. Anyway, so again, some nice research in that area. You can search for yourself if you want to dive into one of these topics. You can do that. All right, so let's get to problem 2 about preference aggregation. So if we are able to reveal preferences, we get people to vote and get people to study all the political programs, etc. Then there is a question: how do we aggregate all this? Okay, so we have votes from all of you, and we have to make one decision based on that. So this is the problem that, with the different views, but only one option must be chosen. So how do we choose it? So there's an important sort of divide here. And I'm going to talk more about this in the voting patterns chapter, where there's a left-right continuum, where the question between optimal quantity of public goods might separate voters. So you might have different views on a spectrum, but then you have to get one outcome, right? So you don't necessarily end up in the center. So say there's a spectrum, a lot of people on the left, a lot of people on the right. But then when they decide together, it's not that the middle ground will win, it's that one option will be chosen, either left or the right. Okay, so this is largely or very much important in the US context, where you have two parties, right? And then only one of them wins. And then they implement all of the Democratic policies when Democrats win. And they implement all of the Republican policies when Republicans win. But it's almost 50-50, right? When you look at the numbers that vote for each of those parties. One increasingly important divide, rather than the left-right continuum, which seems to be less and less of importance if you look into the political programs. They're not about left or right anymore. They don't really talk about optimal quantity of public goods. They sometimes do talk a little bit about the tax system, but not as much. But what we see much more in the sort of more recent years, in the recent elections and across the world, not just here in the Czech Republic, but in the US and around the world, is this cities versus the rural areas, right? This divide is something that I'm going to show you some numbers about, and I think that's the driving force today of elections. You might have seen that if you watch election results, such as the one in last year, the presidential election that we had here. What happens is that the rural areas, they get the results in first because they're smaller in populations, right? So there are smaller villages that vote, and those results get in first. So one candidate is leading by a lot, and then the results from the big cities come in because those are bigger counties. And then the other candidate is trying to catch up and, playing this race. So that's what we see now in elections rather than left or right. All right, so what we need to do to aggregate preferences, two things. One is to decide about a decision rule. How do we make a decision? How do we aggregate the preferences? Which decision rule do we use? And then one more problem is to translate votes into mandates. I'm going to talk to you about what that means and what the different types of these translations we have. All right, so decision rule. What decision making means the next something defined rule or some key. Now, this optimal decision rule will depend on what type of decision you're making, right? So simple majority, again, is a straightforward, elegant solution that it comes naturally to us. So, if at least 50% of the voters agree with this, then we do it, right? But maybe it's not fit for every purpose. And, there are other systems that might be more fit for purpose. For example, you would normally like to have stronger rules for more important issues. So in a case like the Brexit vote, you had a simple majority vote on an issue that will influence very significantly the future of the whole country, right? And you end up with a 51 to 49, right? To change the status quo. Now, I'm sure many people in Britain would have liked to have a stronger rule for important issues like this. And many bodies that make decisions do have a stronger rule for this. So, for example, the Chamber of Deputies has a simple majority for most issues, but for the very important issues, we have a qualified majority vote. But that means that more than 50% have to agree to change something. That's mainly for constitutional issues. So changing the constitution, for example, needs not only 50%, but 67%, 2/3 of the Chamber of Deputies. That's an example, right? So let's talk a little bit about these voting systems and how we classify them and what they can do for us. So one extreme is this unanimity voting. So all agents have to agree. Okay, 100% is the majority rule, right? So this is kind of a special case of the qualified majority rule in which the qualified majority is 100%, right? What that basically means is the full veto right for everyone, right? So if one person doesn't agree, then we don't do it, right? Now, obvious problem, this may be very rigid. It may be very hard to change things, right? So status quo is heavily subsidized in this case. Then you have to convince everybody to change something, right? There's also this 0-1 nature where you have to vote either yes or no, and that's going to be the same for some of the other systems. So then the other side of the spectrum, sort of another corner solution, is the simple majority voting. At least 80% of elections have to agree. So if you have this 0-1 nature on this field, you always make a decision, which is nice. You either say yes or either say no, and then one of the two will have 50% at least of the votes. So one problem is that it needs an odd number of agents, so that will only be a problem when it's a small number of agents. For a large number of agents, this is unlikely to play a role. And it might not lead to an equilibrium, which is kind of a nice, or not a very nice feature, but there's a nice example showing this feature of the system, where if you have multiple variants, so say A, B, C, then A might be preferred to B and B might be preferred to C, but at the same time, C might be preferred to A, right? So you get this cyclical pattern. So if you ask people between two variants, always, make a decision, then they might end up in a sort of an illogical equilibrium where sort of, it goes cyclical. And then something in the middle between these two is called qualified majority voting. So you have at least X%, where X is anywhere between 50 and 100. Right? So again, you need a correct number of agents to set it up correctly, but again, not much of an issue. And then the same things apply. So you give some more weight to the status quo, right? So for things that we think, are very important, such as the constitutional issues in the Czech Republic, you need a qualified majority. There are some other sort of more interesting voting systems that I wanted to mention, and some of them are used, some of them are not used, but maybe they should be. Right? So one of them is sequence of votes. So you vote in rounds. This is quite common in elections. Actually, the presidential election has an element of this. The Senate election also probably has an element of this. That you have rounds, right? So you have, say, for the presidential election, we have 10 candidates, 9 in the first round, and then only 2 of them get to the second round, right? Unless in the first round, somebody gets 50% of the votes, right? Then it would be the end of the election. But, usually you would get these, 2 candidates go to the second round, and then it's basically one of, simple majority in the second round. Now, a problem might be is it's very sensitive to the way you set it up. So, we change a little bit about how you set up these rounds, and it might change a lot the outcome, right? So that's not something you like a lot about voting systems. You ideally would like to have a consistent way of getting people's preferences and aggregating them, regardless of the rule, you would have to, reach the same conclusion. That would be sort of the ideal voting system. There's also the problem of strategic voting. So you might have noticed, so in this last presidential election, just using it as an example, there were election polls showing Mrs. Neruda, who had, quite a bit more votes in the election polls than in the actual election, right? This is an example of strategic voting, right? Because a lot of people would decide, oh, in the election polls, it seems like she has no chance, so my vote would be sort of discarded if I vote for her, right, in the first round. So I would rather vote for one of the candidates that actually have a chance of winning, right? So a lot of people decide in the last moment, even though in election polls they would say, I will vote for this candidate, then in the actual election poll, that election booth, they might choose differently, right? And this is an example of strategic voting. So again, not something that you like so much about a voting system, but that's how we have it. Another system would be ranking and ordering. Basically, you would take all the alternatives and you rank them, right? Or order them. So my preference number 1, and so on. And then the highest sum of the ranks will win, or the lowest sum of the rank, depending on how you set it up. But just that's the way of getting more preferences out of people, right? And it might not lead to an equilibrium. All alternatives have to have the same weight in this simple setup of ranking and ordering. There's a huge issue of the fact that your own preferences might not be perfectly observed by yourself. So you might not have an opinion about the 6th and the 7th and the 8th candidates. But you still have to rank them in this system, right? So it's difficult for you to rank them if you don't have an opinion about them, right? So you don't observe your own preferences so well. Then there's a sort of a movement, I would call it, to implement some more sophisticated methods. One of them, or one of the types of methods, is called combined approval voting. One of the examples, and I'm mentioning it here because it's a sort of a Czech thing, right? Thanks to Karel Janeček, who is sort of a big proponent of this system, Democracy 2.1. But it's an example of a combined approval rating for the voting. What that means is that you give some votes for and some votes against a candidate. Okay. You might also have a setup where you give some votes for indifference. So if you really don't care about those 5 candidates, you just give them indifference, then 1 that you prefer, and then 2 that you definitely don't want, right? So that's a way of getting much more preferences out of people than with a simple majority voting, right? Or a sequence of votes that we have currently. So the problems with this might be that it's too complex, and then there might be strategic voting depending on how you set it up. But generally, the argument for combined approval voting or more sophisticated methods of voting is to get more of the people's preferences out of them, basically, right? So that you can aggregate better. An example for Democracy 2.1, how it would work is, so they had an example here on the website about voting for projects that spend public money. And suppose just for simplicity that all of these projects cost the same amount of money, and there's money for only 2 projects out of 5, right? So you have to decide which of these 5 projects you will build. Now, with simple majority voting, so just counting the blue votes for, then you would build a new parking and a swimming pool, right? Now, with Democracy 2.1, where you get 2 votes for and 1 against, right? That's where the name comes from. So what you would say is, okay, so you give people this option to express also the disapproval of some variants. And you see that the swimming pool is widely opposed, right? Many people don't want it. Okay. So what you would end up with, if you net these out, is that actually you have a different decision, right? You don't build a swimming pool, you renovate it. That's the idea. So they've also tried to implement this in the election where Yazid lost in the second round to Miloš Zeman. So now they set up a website, and then there's a huge issue of selection bias. So people who go to the website actually have a certain type of preferences. So this is not to represent the population, right? This is not a representative sample of the Czech population, but still, you see that for this one sample, Miloš Zeman was the worst candidate out of all the 9 candidates. If we had that system, at least for some group of voters, the worst candidate of 9 candidates actually won the election. Right? So that's not ideal, and you would. This is a very desirable feature of the voting system to sort of extract more preferences. All right, so when we're searching for this ideal political mechanism, I've mentioned a few of those characteristics that we would really like the voting system to have. And there's actually some more theoretical work that actually formally proves some of these arguments. So this is the work of Kenneth Arrow, who says there are 4 characteristics that you would like in an ideal political mechanism. The first is transitivity. So if you prefer A to B and then B to C, then ideally you would always prefer A to C. It's kind of the transitivity of preferences that I said in some of the voting systems is not ensured. You would like a non-dictatorial choice. The system has to be democratic, not autocratic. So this is kind of a very straightforward demand that we would have from a political mechanism. What he proves sort of formally, mathematically, is that you need independence of irrelevant alternatives. What that means is that if I gave you a choice between A and B, you should not be influenced in this particular choice by the existence or non-existence of some variance C, right? So ideally, every time I would put in front of you A and B, you would always choose A, then you would choose it even though there is C, right? In the available options list, right? So that's again the mathematical feature that you need to prove it. And then the unrestricted domain characteristics that the mechanism has to work in all settings. What that means is that for any election, you ideally have the same political mechanism that is this ideal one. What he shows is there is no system that satisfies all of these 4. However, if you realize the 4th condition, so that was just that the mechanism has to work in all settings, you get very close to an ideal political mechanism under some assumptions. So the most important of these assumptions that I wanted to mention here is that is single peak preferences. What that means is that you vote on an issue, say how much money do you want to spend on public schools, right? Now, with simple majority voting, basically the equilibrium will exist. That's the theorem. What that means is that if you say, okay, do you prefer 100 or 10,000? Then people would say 10,000. Then you ask, okay, do you prefer 8,000 or 12,000? They say 8,000, right? So you might get to this ideal with a simple majority voting, always presenting one issue at a time, yes or no. Then you get to this equilibrium where you get to the actual optimal amount of public spending, but only if there are single peak preferences. Now, what that means is that when I ask you about the value of money you'll be wanting to spend on public education, say, this is the amount of money, this is the utility that you get from that money. Basically, how much utility you get from spending that amount of money on public schooling. A single peak preference would be this. So, you might prefer a lot. You might also have single peak preferences like this. You might prefer 0, right? You might have single peak preferences like this. You might prefer some optimal point here, okay? So this is your spending optimal, right? Now, those are all single peak preferences. But what you can actually have is multi-peak preferences, and that is either here or here. Here's 1, and here's 2. Now, what that means is, I should use a different color. When you have multi-peak preferences, meaning this, is there are multiple peaks that are same utility, but very different spending, right? So either you prefer a lot of spending, or you prefer 0 spending. Now, what that might depend on, and why I said the example of public schooling, I had the example of the rich and public versus private schools, is that, of course, you have to decide whether you put your kid in a public school or not. If you do, then you prefer this. If you don't, then you prefer this, right? You don't want your money to be spent on public schools if your kid doesn't go there, right? So that's an example where you could have potentially multi-key preferences where, you would either prefer a lot if you're using the service, or zero if you're not using the service, right? So that obviously will present an issue when you're asking that person about how much they want to spend, because at some point they will say, okay, I want to spend less and less and less and less, and then suddenly it will say, I want to spend more and more and more, right? Anyway, so we might get this cyclical pattern. There's a nice example in the textbook on the income tax schedule. I'm not going to go through here, but you can check it out. All right. So that's about decision rules, right? So how do we make a decision? So that's the voting system issue. Now let's get to translating votes into mandates. So there's this huge issue that you have a large number of voters, but you have only a few candidates. So this might be viewed as a mathematical issue, but it's really important because it can have very big consequences on the outcome of the election. So there are many decisions to make here in this realm of decisions. For example, what is the level of constituency? What that means is that you aggregate preferences at a different level, right? So for example, in the Czech election to the Chamber of Deputies, you aggregate it at the regional level, right? So for each of the 13 regions, you have a separate sort of candidate list, and then you will aggregate the preferences of people only within that region. As a counterexample, Slovakia has a national constituency for the Chamber of Deputies, but that means if they aggregate all of them together, right? So it cannot happen that in one region, one party will get a lot of votes and then none of them in the other because they have a national constituency. So that's one of the things that you have to decide. How many candidates do you assign to each constituency? Do you do it just based on population, or do you take into account some other factors, right? So obviously, a very populous region should have more mandates in the Chamber of Deputies than a much less populated region, right? Just to have a sort of a similar representativeness of those candidates to people, right? In the presence of political parties, how do you sort candidates on the list of political parties, right? So you will have a Czech Social Democratic Party ballot, right? And there's a list of candidates. So how do you sort these? Do you have a closed list or an open list? Do you have preferences that you can, circle out that you really like this person, but you don't like the other persons on the ballot, etc. So that's another decision to be made. Do you want to impose any thresholds to enter? So, for example, in the Czech Republic, we have a 5% threshold to enter the Chamber of Deputies for a political party, right? So if you have less than 5%, you don't enter. The main reason being that you want less parties in the government, in the Chamber of Deputies, so that it's easier to achieve this, right? Once you're in the Chamber of Deputies, so you don't want a party with just one mandate, right? We don't have that. And then one big issue is what you do with the remainders, right? What I mean by remainders, let's get into that again. Many issues that you can dive into for a long time, but let's dive into the last one. What do you do with remainders? What a remainder means is basically that, since you have a large number of votes and a small number of mandates, if you divide the votes by the mandates, there's a remainder to be taken care of, right? So say you have 5,561 voters and 4 parties, right? So these two numbers, it's not divisible by 4. So there is a remainder after you divide it, right? And so what do you do with that? So there are two methods, two main types of methods to deal with the remainders. One is called the highest averages methods, and the other one is largest remainder methods. Now we use the highest averages method for the Chamber of Deputies, for example. We used to use the DONT method, now we use the imperially method. They largely work the same, they just have different parameters, so we're going to talk about those differences a little bit more. And then quite a different approach to it is the largest remainder method, and we're going to dive into that too. All right, so the DONT method is a sort of example of this highest averages method, one of the most used ones, the DONT method. It works like this. So each party has a certain number of votes, right? And then this mandate assignment is done in rounds. That's the big idea of the DONT method, or the highest averages method. So there are these quotients that you define. Okay? There's a number called a quotient. And in each round, you calculate this quotient for every party. Now, V is the number of received votes, and M is the number of mandates that are assigned so far to the party. So every party starts with 0, and then it increases as you assign mandates to them in the rounds. So I have an example here that will show how it works. So a very simple example, you have 4 mandates, you have 3 political parties, A, B, and C. So obviously these are not divisible, so you have to decide what to do with that one extra mandate, basically. So let's say these parties obtained 180 and 45 votes, respectively. So you go in rounds, right? That's the main idea. So in the first round, you calculate the quotient as the number of received votes, which is 100 for party A, over n plus 1. N is 0 for each party, right? So you calculate these quotients as 100, 80, and 45. Now, the highest is for party A, and so in the first round, you assign a mandate to party A. That's why it's middle. So if you go to the second round afterwards, you enter 1 here for n, because party A already has a mandate. These 2 parties still have 0 mandates, and so you have 0 here. So now this quotient is 50 for party A, 80 for party B, and 45 for party C. So party B gets a mandate. And you go with rounds like this. In the third round, again, you calculate these quotients, and you see that the party A has 50, party B has 40, and party C has 45. So you assign a mandate to party A. Then again, you add 1 to the number of mandates that they already have. And this is how it's done, right? So the last mandate goes to party C. So they end up with a total of 2 mandates for party A, 1 mandate for party B, 1 mandate for party C. So basically, the DONT method is a way to translate the election results, which we had initially, so 180 and 45, to mandates, 2, 1, and 1. Now you see that the averages are quite different, right? So here, party A actually has a larger representation in the decision making than the number of voters that voted for it, right? Party B, much less, right? So party B is a little bit beat by the fact that we have the DONT method. And party C also gets a little bit extra, right? So if you use a different method, it might end up differently, depending on the election result. This is again quite a vibrant area to study, and many proponents of different quotas and different sort of mathematical formulas that will work better for one party or another. So these other highest average methods, so we have the DONT method as the quotient was this one, right? N plus 1 is here. We have the other ones where we have different quotients, but the same mechanism applies. So again, subtle differences in the definition of the method to translate votes into mandates, but can have serious implications for the result. The second family of methods to translate votes into mandates is called the largest remainder methods. Right? What you do there is you assign a quota, or sometimes called the election number, which you set for every party, and then all votes are divided by this quota. Right? These integers will be directly translated to mandates, and the remainders will be ordered. So let's get into it again on an example so that you see what I mean. It's quite straightforward again. So here's an example where we have 100,000 total votes, and we have 6 parties, right? By colors, right? So yellow's got 47,000, 47% of the votes. So what you do is, if you have 10 seats to allocate, 10 mandates, right? You calculate what we call a quota, right? So here's the Hare quota, just votes over seats. You can also have the drop quota, votes over seats plus 1. So again, small differences, but can have some implications. Now, so the Hare quota is 10,000 here. So what you do is you divide the number of votes by this quota, and you get this number. So 4.7, 1.6, etc. Now, these automatic seats are the integers of this, the whole numbers, below this. So 4 out of 4.7. And then 0.7 remains. That's the remainder, right? And so the largest remainder method will then look at these remainders and allocate the remaining seat, right? So they've allocated 7 in the automatic seats round. And then in the next round, the remainders, you have 3 to allocate. And so you say, okay, this is the highest. This is the second highest. This is the second highest. And this is the third highest. Right? So the 3 highest remainders get an additional mandate, basically. And that's how you translate these votes into these mandates, right? And you've assigned 10. So you don't go in rounds. You go in directly in a fixed amount of steps. All right, does that make sense? So you can see how they might lead to very similar results, or they might also lead to very different results, right? And so there is no objectively better way to do things. That's also why it's been so contested. All right, so in practice, we developed very complex voting systems. When you decide on all of these issues, you might have different combinations in different countries. These change all the time as well. So I've changed this slide over the years. Every year I have to change something about this, I feel. So the Czech Chamber of Deputies, we have a proportional representation system by political party and by region. So that's the level of constituency. I mentioned that. We have a 5% threshold for entry of party. The most recent change in this system was these thresholds for coalitions. So if you have a coalition of 2 parties, then you have an 8% threshold to reach. If you have a coalition of 3 parties or more, it's 11%. Okay. So the whole coalition doesn't get in if the whole coalition together does not get 11%. Right? Used to be 15 until recently. We use the Hare quota to distribute mandates across constituencies. So this is like one level before what we talked about, right? How do you, so I had that as one issue, right? How do you assign the number of mandates in each constituency? We use the Hare quota. And since 2021, we use the imperial quota to assign mandates to parties, so the imperial method of highest averages. You can read more under this link if you go to the slides. There's a huge amount of text that has been written, explaining every detail. This has to be transparent, and people should be able to reconstruct the systems, and then model the changes, etc. Another great thing to do as a research question: what would happen if? All right, so let's get a little bit into voting patterns. So this is the presidential election in the Czech Republic in 2013. There has been a running joke. So this is about exactly the rural and urban divide, right? So you can see that cities like Prague and Liberec and Hradecká, Pardubice, Plzeň, Brno, all of these large cities, so most of these large cities in the Czech Republic vote differently than the rest of the country, right? Here is the same pattern for the recent presidential election last year. There have been jokes that the electoral map kind of looks like a guy sitting on the toilet pooping, and Pilsen is the poop. But the wider trend is the broader trend is that cities vote very differently than more rural areas outside of the capital, etc. This is not just isolated in the Czech Republic. This is a sort of a broad pattern. Here is the presidential election in the U.S. So this is by county, so the small municipalities and regional counties that are administrative units in the U.S. And so blue is Democrats and red is Republicans. And you can see the same thing. Large cities in California, on the East Coast as well, Chicago, Atlanta, large cities in Florida like Miami and Orlando, and, large cities primarily now vote Democratic in the US, right? That's a pattern that you see as an overwhelming trend, right? So it's not really about left or right anymore. It's about if you live in a city or not, right? As you could say, like that's a much more important trend now. If you look 40 years ago, this is the electoral map in 1980, where again blue is Democratic, red is Republican. Now that divide was not there back then. So you see large cities, some of them red, some of them blue. You cannot really say, right? So San Francisco, Los Angeles are red. Atlanta is overwhelmingly blue here. Chicago is blue. So you might have other issues that will decide elections, rather than just if you live in a city or not, but that's how today's voting patterns work. It's a huge problem, so we don't really know what to do about it. So there's this huge divide. You can see it in, okay, so I have Slovakia here, the Chamber of Deputies, but you can see it in the presidential election that just happened this past weekend. But the trend is exactly the same. So I really like this chart because this is on municipal level. So the size of the bubble means the population of a city. And then the color is which political party you want. This is the Chamber of Deputies elections. So here's Progresivné Slovensko, so one in Bratislava and all the major cities, Košice, etc. Smer, who is the overall winner of that election, is winning in smaller cities and many of the villages. They have in Slovakia they have a big community of Hungarian ethnicity, so there's a big pattern of that in the south of Slovakia. But again, overwhelmingly, the trend is that cities go differently than counties. And as I said, there is not really a good solution to this. The divide is only, increasing, it seems, and we're not sure where that will lead. So we had we had two recent elections here in the Republic where sort of the cities won, you could say, right? That we were able to sort of get over that threshold, and you look at the results on TV and you see this first election results come in, and you're like, oh, okay, my city is losing, and I'm saying here it's my city is in Prague. And then we were able in the last two important elections in the Czech Republic to overturn that sort of the rural results, and get the more liberal candidate. In Slovakia, they had the opposite, so they were not able to do that in the cities in Slovakia. So the chamber of deputies as well as the presidential election now has gone the other way, basically, in many ways than it did in Czechia. All right. Any questions or opinions about voting patterns, trends? Do you see the same, that the cities and the rural divide is much more important now than the left, right? Yes.
I was just thinking that maybe, that could it also be possible that these things are interconnected, like left and right and rural and urban, forget that. Because when I look at, for example, the politics of the Democratic and Republican Party, it's very much left and right, but also like it's not completely gone, left and right divide, maybe just like mixed with the.
Yes, for sure. And again, this is correlation. It's not causation for sure. So like if a person that has strong conservative views moves to a very liberal city, it's not going to change their views most likely, right? So this is not causation, but it is how people sort themselves into living in cities. If you're more liberal, you get more into city. But it is also true that there is some causation mechanism, I think, and then again, a good area to study, because it's so timely that, if you do live in a big community and you meet a lot with other people, you're more likely to be of liberal views rather than conservative views, more open, open trade and liberal values rather than conservatism and protectionism, which is the opposite of this, in a sense. That is more likely to happen if you're, say, in a small village where you don't meet a lot of people, etc. So there is some causation, I think, behind it, but I would say it's largely correlation. And you can study the population in many different ways, right? So if you look at education levels, for example, you look at unemployment rates, those are all correlated with where you live, and will explain the same pattern trend. All right. Any more ideas? Cool. Let's get to the last chapter. 15 minutes is perfect. So about power exercise. So as I said in the very beginning, the public sector, the government, is composed of private agents, people like us. We can be elected to form the government, to decide, to represent other voters, right? To decide on their behalf. And so there is the divide sometimes between the individual welfare of the officials and the social welfare. Okay? So what they want for themselves as politicians and what they should want for their voters, right? There might be a difference between these two. And that's where this concept of political corruption, or rather just a corruption definition, is abuse of political power for private gain, right? So if you give someone power, political power, and they abuse it for their own private gain, that's the broadest definition of corruption that you have. And that's very important in deciding who will be making decisions on our behalf, right? So there is this connected concept in economics called the principal agent problem, which you've most likely seen in previous courses in microeconomics. And that is that there's a principal and there's an agent. So the agent makes decisions on behalf of the principal. Those are not always aligned, right? So there might be conflict of interest. So say if a politician is deciding in the sort of most direct and straightforward decision for this, a conflict of interest, is that somebody has to decide how large salaries will be in the Chamber of Deputies, right? And it's the Chamber of Deputies making laws, so they have to decide about their own salaries, right? So there is a very direct conflict of interest, not much of an issue economically, but you could imagine, people having business interests in, say, biofuels, and then making environmental regulations about biofuels, right? So obviously, an outcome of the political process might be more or less beneficial depending on how it goes for that one person if they have business interests, right? If you own media, for example, you might be tempted to use the media to advance your political agenda rather than what you would do for the social welfare point of view, if you're a politician that also owns media. So those are very sort of important examples of conflicts of interest and of rent-seeking type of mechanisms. That rent-seeking meaning that you extract rent from a system via these means of imposing some of the more shady mechanisms. The related concept of cronyism is just putting your friends basically into positions of power. That's the definition of cronyism. The crony capitalism that you come into office and you change the head of the financial administration. So, as a that would be an example of cronyism if you change it for someone who's more favorable to you, your friend or your allies. And then there's this issue of political connections and financing politics more broadly. That again is the one that I want to focus on a little bit more here. Primarily, not because it would be the most important one of those issues, but primarily because I've done some work in that area. And so I thought that might be a good thing to dive into a little bit more. So the way politics and political parties and politicians are financed is important because that's exactly the case where you can have conflicts of interest and those negative effects that you might have. By these special interest groups, they might try to influence the decisions of politicians for their own profit. So not necessarily it doesn't have to be a conflict of interest directly. You being a businessman that owns an agricultural company, right, and then you being a prime minister or minister of the agriculture, right? It can be that your business friends will give money to your political party in exchange for some favors, right? And so you can either have political parties financed publicly or privately. And publicly meaning from the public budget, so basically from taxes. We have a combination of that. We have some public financing, and it's very, very important, mainly after elections. The political parties get a large sum of money distributed based on the election result. So that's their biggest source of revenue. But they have, in the Czech Republic, they have quite a big source of revenue also in the private sector. So one question that I asked in my sort of research previously is whether we should allow individual people or companies to use their money basically to influence the thinking of others. Should we allow private financing with politics? Does it give some undue advantage to rich people and rich companies that they can exert more influence on other voters, right, and to make profit out of it? Should we allow companies to do that? Is a sort of more specific question. And asking, so companies are these abstract entities that we create with the sole purpose of making profit. Should they be allowed to give money to political parties? These are abstract entities, right? They're not entities that can think in and of themselves. It's always the people behind them, making the doing the thinking for an abstract entity, if you could define it that way. So do they view financing politics as an investment? Are politicians going to return the favor using some public funds? Do they give them more public procurement contracts? Do they give them some exemptions from regulations, etc.? And so are all these ways in which politicians actually can return the favor legal? And if so, are they ethical and desirable? So that's the kind of questions that I explored there. So again, in Czechia, we have a mix of both public and private financing. So what happened recently is that so the information on donors of political parties has always been publicly available, but it used to be only in the physical form. You had to go to the library of the parliament, and you would see these annual reports of political parties and see long lists of donors or companies and individuals who are donating anywhere between 5 Czech crowns to millions of Czech crowns. And you would have these lists in the parliamentary library, which is nice that it's public, but it wasn't, we weren't able to analyze that data. So what we did is we created this website called Politická finance, where you can see this in like a machine readable form, and you can download the data set and do something with it. So that was part of my job there, that I collected the data, I digitalized the data for the first time, Now it's actually done automatically, so you can see that in real time, because parties now submit electronically their annual reports, and so it's all automatic. No more need for the manual labor that I have to sort of put in to create the data set. So, the public financing is about 500 million Czech crowns every year, and then additional 500 million is what political parties get together in election years. These private financing options include both natural and legal persons. So in some countries, it's not actually legal for companies to donate money to political parties. We have it capped now at 3 million Czech crowns per year party in person, including companies. So it's not much of a threshold or a limit, because you can just have multiple companies and donate 3 million with each of those companies. So it's not a very good limit, but that's how we have it capped currently. So when we looked at the data, so what do these donors of political parties look like? Okay, the companies, I mean. What we found out is 30% of Czech public procurement suppliers donating money to political parties. Quite a heavy overrepresentation of political donors within the receivers or suppliers of public procurement. 20% of these corporate donors receive some form of EU funding, so rely on state grants. Around 5% of these companies that were donating money to political parties were shell companies, some even economically inactive. 8% are offshore companies, so we're not sure who actually owns them. So there's another sort of underlying issue. If you allow companies to donate money to political parties, you sometimes don't know who owns those companies, because you don't have beneficial ownership registers. And so you don't see who gave money to this political party. And that's, of course, a big problem, because then you don't know whether that person received something as a favor, right? So here's a chart that sort of motivates that analysis, and that is, so here's the share on total donations by party. So, this party would receive 35% of the total donations in that particular year. And you have two columns here, 2013 and 2014. The reason I focus on these 2 years is that in 2013, there was a snap election. Some of you might remember, it was the government fell and we had a quick election, unexpected. So you want this kind of thing in your research. That is, not an anticipated effect. So this was a snap election, so that a nice opportunity for research. And at the same time, the whole government switched, basically. And here you see the numbers on top of these bars are the members of government. So for ODS, the Civic Democratic Party, it went from 6 to 0 after that election. For Top Nolai, it went from 5 to 0. And there was another one, Věci-veřejné, I think matters, 4 to 0. Okay, so that was the government before that election. And then the new government was here, KDU-ČSL with 3 members of government, ANO with 6 members, and then ČSSD with 8 members. Now, you see that there's a pattern, right? For Civic Democratic Party, after they lost the election, that many people stopped donating money to that party. On the other hand, for those parties that are now in the government, many people started donating money. Many companies specifically started donating money to these parties instead of the parties that they donated to previously. And so there's this question of what do these companies want from it, right? Once this party wins an election, I start donating money to them. Okay, that's most fishy, right? So what I did is that I matched companies that donated money to political parties and those that didn't. And again, I looked at pairs of exactly the same company. I tried to match based on all the observable characteristics to sort of isolate this effect of donating money to a political party. And I tried to find for every donor, every company that donated money to a political party, I tried to find a set of very similar companies on every other aspect, other than that they did not donate money to the political parties. And then I compared the two groups, right? So on average, I find that the companies that did donate money to political parties, in the subsequent years, they could see 8 to 12% higher profits. Okay, so this is quite a big effect, and it's a big return on your investment. I actually show that the return on investment, that the donations are relatively small, so the company might donate 100,000 Czech crowns, but they will get a large return in terms of additional profits. So the return on that investment was about 1,100%. Okay, so if you donated money, let's say 100,000 Czech crowns, on average, you could have expected to get 11 times that in profits, in additional profits, compared to companies that are very similar to you, but have not donated money to the political party. So there are some effects in other countries as well. There's some research in Italy that does this, and some in Denmark find a little bit lower effects. I don't find evidence of an effect of higher donations in value. So if you donate more money, it does not have so much of an effect as, the fact that you donate money. There was a little intensive versus expensive margin, we call that. There was quite a big difference in that. And we find a weaker effect when we compare to the donating firms to non-donating firms that are engaged with the public sector. So if you just look at companies that win public procurement, you don't see a difference between donating and non-donating firms. What it might mean is that there are other types of connections that we don't observe in the data, right? So I saw campaign contributions, and I established the connection saying, okay, if this company gave 100,000 crowns to this party, then there's a connection. Of course, that's not the whole picture. They might have been classmates from school, right? The head of the party and the head of the business, right? You don't observe those types of connections, and that's what might get you more public procurement contracts as well. So it seems like this is an important channel of how companies get this additional value, that they will get sort of additional public procurement contract from the government if they are connected somehow to the political party that's in power at that time. All right, any questions about this? Yes, please.
So there is like more and more the idea of asking like a critical alien problem when we talk about corruption, to like a collective action. That sometimes it's more comprehensive in understanding and explaining how corruption happens within a society. But then how does that can be investigated, for example, with these kind of research that talks about financing campaigns and things like that? If you want, because here very clearly you have an electoral system that has certain rules, and then that is the one that kind of can either have a fine to a party or to an individual within the party, but how about the root in these other theoretical system?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we have the simulation for, right? That's why they are done. And you could simulate what would happen if we allowed 16-year-olds to vote. And it is a large difference from, that's the more reason to have that debate, right? If you have a strong effect on political donations, then maybe you shouldn't allow those political donations because they seem to be very important channels of getting additional value from the public sector, right? Which is, closely tied to corruption. So I would say that, us as economists, we can provide this evidence and, help in that way. Does that make sense? And, I encourage you all to engage in that type of research. That's useful. All right. We'll see you next week then. Thank you. Thank you. It's